All right, welcome back, folks. Today we're talking about Chapter 2, Theory in Race and Ethnic Relations. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about now harkens back to introductory sociology, the intro class. So with respect to building blocks of theory, basic notions of what theory and theories are all about within sociology. And so in a lot of respects, you can think of theory or theories ultimately as a general statement or explanation of how the world works. And so it's sort of, in a way, the referee's view of the game. It's a way that the game is ultimately called. So often within sociology, we think of the theories as actual perspectives, ways of viewing and understanding the world and how it's structured and how it's organized. So the theory as a general idea or statement of the workings of the social world is also comprised of a lot of subordinate, ancillary, supporting, if you will, ideas that are, again, a part of the pillar which supports the big one. So largely within sociology, we look at functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. And we also have additional theories as well, particularly with respect to race and ethnicity. We're also talking about critical race theory as well as intersection theory. And again, these are ways within which we can explain society, the social world, particularly in terms of race as a social construction and the development of race within society. A lot of that going back to sort of the racial formation discussion and process that was offered by Omi and Winant. So what we'll do is, for a lot of you and for a lot of our purposes here, a lot of what we're going to do is a good chunk of review of ultimately what each of these theories is about and how it tries to explain what's going on and what happens in society, particularly with a racial component or with regard to race. All right, so we're going to start with functionalism, and often we think of this as functional theory for short. So with functionalism or functional theory, we're looking at a way of thinking that says, it asserts that each society has a set of parts within it, and each part has a unique purpose and function that ultimately contributes to the stability of the whole. So for functionalists, and for looking at things in a functionalist way, we're ultimately assuming from the beginning that any society we look at, any range of cultures and groupings and races within that society, has a way of functioning that lends itself as a whole towards stability. So we have these, if you will, more overt ways of functioning, the more manifest, the intended functions of how society should work and how its parts should work. And then we have the hidden or the more latent functions that kind of go along with overall the inner workings of society. Where there is dysfunction, typically functionalists will say that that's kind of a momentary thing, that it's not really going to last for very long, because they note that because society trends towards stability, well, why would there be dysfunction in the first place? And so the idea is that typically dysfunction, elements that are dysfunctional, will be weeded out by the overarching smoothness, if you will, and the smooth functionality of society. All right, so that's one of the ways within which we can think of any society, any kind of social organism, and any sort of social structure. And you can think of the social structure as the stable patterns of behavior that we observe within families, within communities, but also within racial groups and between racial groups. And so in a lot of respects, you could, and it has been, taken to this particular logical notion or conclusion that there is a certain functional element to what we have with respect to race, including racism. Granted, you can take it to that extreme, or you can take it to that extent. At the same time, that also brings to mind a lot of the limitations of functionalism. Racism is and discrimination, they are inherently dysfunctional. And so why is it rather that these inherently dysfunctional aspects of society, why is it that they hang around so much if society is geared towards and intended towards stability? So it's really insufficient to just say that, all right, the racism we see, the discrimination that we see, the implicit bias that we see, it's not enough to just say that, well, those are dysfunctions that'll be worked out, because quite frankly, they have not been worked out in centuries. So we have to have additional theories and additional ways of explaining what happens in society, ultimately to give us a fuller picture of really what we can see and happening across the range and the spectrum of race and racial diversity within our society. Now, functionalists do, it can be noted, if you will, according to functional ways of theorizing, that the dysfunctional nature of racism, the dysfunctional nature of discrimination, can, in a lot of respects, strengthen bonds, particularly within those groups that are minority or subordinated within society. So it can contribute to group solidarity within those groups, but at the same time, so can many other things that are intended functions for the social system. So of course, if we're looking at the function, or the actual presence, I should say, of racism and of discrimination, again, we're looking at something that is inherently dysfunctional, despite the fact that it can bring about group cohesion for the groups that are targeted in that respect. Also, additional dysfunctions include the racial wealth gap, racial profiling, and of course the overall wasted potential of members of minority groups within society. So we can't just simply say that, well, these are things that go along with the overall manifest function. We can't just say that these are dysfunctions that'll eventually be weeded out. Again, we know that there is much more to how society functions and operates beyond the ordinary mainstream function, or ordinary, if you will, mainstream ideas of functional theory. So if we think about this critically, there are many limitations of the functionalist approach with respect to understanding and explaining racism within our society and a lot of racial dynamics within our society. So we have the persistence of inhumane dysfunctions in a supposedly rational system. So that's one of the challenges with functionalist thinking, is that it really stresses and focuses on the rationality excuse me, of social systems. And again, how can you really take that logically as far as possible with respect to an analysis of race, racism, ethnicity, and how they function in the social history of our society? Again, those limitations have to be clarified, and they have to be understood in ways that help us get the most out of what we're trying to gather with respect to understandings in depth about race, ethnicity, and culture. So there are, again, notions of solidarity that are occurring. You know, the stickiness, the group cohesion that can happen. There are those notions of solidarity among racial groups. And so if we're thinking amongst minority groups, if we're thinking amongst Latinx folks, Asian American folks, African American folks, Native American folks, folks who are multiracial, the bonds, the solidarity that the groups create, that does in some respects have relationship to their subordinated status within society. But again, there are healthier, intended, manifest ways that we could also see that accomplished. And so again, functionalism cannot really meaningfully explain long-term dysfunction, particularly, again, that which is inhumane, that which is inherently tragic and misanthropic. All right. So again, we can get some things, we can get certain things, key things, out of the functionalist perspective, particularly how it notes and looks at the establishment of solidarity amongst different kinds and groupings of people. That despite all the diversity we have in society, we do have solidarity that contributes to the stability of the whole. But again, when we get to inhumane dysfunctions, again, how do we explain that? Society is not automatically, as a rational organism, weeding those out. And so we've got to find a way to explain that and explain things more deeply, and then that leads us into additional theorizing, and in this case that brings us to conflict theory. Now with conflict theory, we're drawing on a lot of the work of Karl Marx and Engels, and we're looking at ultimately the notion that any society we look at is comprised of different groups with conflicting interests concerning scarce resources within that society, and that there are bonds and social solidarity. We have that social structure, but again, a lot of that bond that we see, that connectivity between groups, is often really a power struggle if we look more deeply inside. So the elite of society and its powerful groups, they control society's norms and its overall functioning. And so conflict theory comes in and says, all right, well, we have the solidarity and social structure to some extent that the functionalists point out, but when it comes down to it, the elite are the ones that create and set and enforce the rules and put them in place. And so we're looking really at historically the white power structures in our society and white racism being responsible for the overall norms with respect to race and society's function. So the multi-generational power struggle between whites and people of color concerning a lack of basic human rights, citizenship, legal status, property inheritance, restrictions on people of color versus unrestricted freedoms for whites. Ironically, these were ensured by the enslavement of African Americans and the forced subjugation of people of color. Disenfranchisement, exploitation, and suppression of people of color by whites through individual and institutional racist practices. So these are examples, this is exemplary, if you will, of how the elite within society, and again, we're looking at whites as an elite, how they created and how they enforced and reinforced subordinated status for minority groups. And so we're looking at that disenfranchisement happening through that exploitation, that suppression of people of color by whites, that happened on two levels, individual levels as well as the institutional level. And we'll talk more about how they've operated for various groups within society over time. However, conflict theory also has its limitations. And so for some, the notion here is that really conflict theory overstates conflict, that not every aspect of societal discourse and social experience is an arena of conflict, that there are ways within which, for instance, whites and folks of color have come together with respect to racial reconciliation, at least on a limited means, but also in terms of just everyday social interactions, right? So we do have solidarity possibilities across racial lines, but also across class lines and across gender lines as well. Okay. All right, so that brings us to symbolic interaction. So symbolic interaction comes along, and a lot of this draws from the work of Mead and Cooley, and of course Irving Goffman as some of the leading, if you will, theorists in this regard. So with symbolic interaction, the main assumption here is that human beings, we act and interact with each other based upon the meanings that we attach to social experiences, and that these interactions, these meanings involve the words we've used, obviously, but the symbols and the gestures that we exchange within the interaction. So the meanings, what we get ultimately out of being social, those arise from and are reinforced by the interaction itself. And so for symbolic interactionists, it's not simply about how much conflict there is in society. It's not simply about how much cooperation there is within society. It's ultimately about, okay, what's happening right here and now? What's happening within each interaction that we see in society? And ultimately, the sum total of all of these individual disparate interactions is what gives us society at any particular point in time. And so again, for symbolic interaction, prejudice and discrimination develop as white folks interact with each other. Minority groups are subordinated in society through the use of symbols by whites, the dominant group. Racist communication and forms of that those shape social structures, and they also shape social interactions. And labels. Symbolic interaction looks at a lot at the power of labels. Labels are powerful. The power of labels, those as symbolic structures, influence and reinforce interactions, right? So the idea here is that small group interactions matter, that small scale interactions matter, and that ultimately a lot of what we see in the grander, bigger picture of things is predicated or based upon smaller scale interactions. However, again, there are limitations, of course, to symbolic interaction. Again, all of these theories you can think of as tools in the toolkit of really trying to understand society. But when it comes down to it, each of these tools, as sharp as they are, they're limited in a lot of respects by their very own assumptions. So, for symbolic interaction, one of the key limitations, thinking about it critically, is that it de-emphasizes power dynamics within society. And so we have to note a lot of what conflict theory has to say about power and how power is distributed. So power being unevenly distributed does bring about different symbols, does bring about different ways of expressing words and gestures. It brings about different meanings. It brings about different ways that folks can act and react based upon the meanings that they've attached to social experiences. So it may assume an equivalency that we all kind of have the same level of power, and that's really not the case. And that brings us to intersection theory. This asserts really that multiple categories socially kind of combine and they crisscross to produce nuanced, unique forms of oppression in society. We can't really separate their impacts from each other. So how we experience race is shaped by gender and gender identity, but also how we experience race is shaped by social class, sexual orientation, disability, just to name a few of additional statuses and identities that ultimately mismatch, intersect, and impinge upon race, and of course are mutually reinforcing. Multiple layers of disadvantage intersect to create the way that we experience race. And so we're also looking at how do we experience race perhaps as a member of the working class, or as a member of the working poor, or as a member of the middle class who is inherently subjugated by those who are wealthy and upper class. So solving social problems has to take into account the multiple identities that we have and the multiple statuses that we have. And so we can't just look at race and ethnicity in isolation. We have to look at them with respect to gender, with respect to sexual orientation, with respect to gender identity, and with respect to able-bodied disability status, just to name a few. However, as broad and as comprehensive and as inclusive as intersection theory can be, the comprehensive nature of it is challenging to understand and to implement. It does require a great deal of intention, a great deal of focus, and a great deal of work. And so a lot of the work that we see, particularly with respect to intersection theory and next up critical race theory, come from the great work of Kimberly Crenshaw as well as Patricia Hill Collins. Excuse me. All right, and going on to critical race theory. So we're looking here at the centering of race within the discussion of multiple categories, multiple social categories, and their intersections. So it ultimately says and states that race has been built into the norms, social structures, and the institutions of our society in a manner that reinforces white dominance at the expense of people of color. It also goes on and notes that racial hierarchies, the levels and layers that we talked about before, those hierarchies and layers and inequalities grow out of our social norms. So everyday patterns of interaction, when we're stopping at a store, when we're stopped at a light, when we go to a concert, when we ask someone for directions. And so even though these are small group interactions, we know that power, privilege, and subordination, the lack of power and privilege, are a part of those. And they are also, of course, part of what supports these uneven dynamics within our society. Racial inequality in our society is directly related to white dominance of institutions. And so we're talking about the media, we're talking about the criminal justice system, we're talking about the legal system, we're talking about the government, we're talking about our financial systems and the economy. And so all of how those operate ultimately reinforce, if you will, white dominant norms. Minority group experiences are a function of all of these different intersections, particularly in terms of statuses and different kinds and layers and levels of status. However, in terms of intersectionality, even though obviously race is a critical portion and component of that, even with noting that there is the possibility of overstating, if you will, the impact of race in a discussion of intersectionality. And again, these theories, great tools, great ways of thinking, but they also have their limitations. Also, it needs to be noted that there are patterns of intergroup relations, ways within which groups of color as well as white folks have historically and presently interacted within our society. So you can kind of think of what we're talking about now as the intergroup relations continuum, where you're looking at more open ways that are affirming and tolerant and humanistic on one end, and you're looking at more closed, intolerant, misanthropic ways on the other end of the range. And so think of a continuum really as a range of experiences, a range of social experiences. On the more open humanistic end, these patterns of intergroup relations involve coexistence of varied racial and cultural groups in a way that is mutually respectful, largely without prejudice or discrimination. So this is viewed, it's lauded as an ideal goal for society that, of course, is elusive, very, very difficult to reach. And so the civil rights movement, if we think about the racial reckoning of 2020, 4 years ago, those are good ways of thinking about how we're trying to approach the more open, tolerant, pluralist, multiculturalist, humanistic way of doing things. And you have some ways within which of this continuum that you could argue are kind of mixed or intermediate. Here you're looking at assimilation, fusion, amalgamation, and separatism. So here, the equal status of historically coexisting, unique racial and ethnic groups is changed to accommodate their combination or completely separate groups within the same territory. Each of these has been seen as ideal for society at different points in history, such as the boarding school policies intent on forced assimilation of Native Americans, particularly children, Native American kids, if you will, with respect to dominant white mainstream society. So at different points, just using Native American kids and children as an example, during U.S. history, at different points, assimilation was thought to be the ultimate way to get folks of minority status, so to speak, into the mainstream of society. That the mainstream of society was the goal, where there wouldn't be overt differences between folks of color, groups of color, and white folks. And so forced assimilation was done in a lot of respects to Native Americans, and we'll see also in the experience of other groups of color as well, with the goal being, okay, if everyone is alike or more alike than different, that'll make society easier to work and things will work more smoothly. Most of those notions, movements, and efforts were disastrous and were incredibly inhumane, to say the least. And then that leads us to the more misanthropic, closed, and tolerant end of the intergroup relations continuum. Here we're looking at internal colonialism, expulsion, and extermination. So on this end of the range, things are not, there's not really a goal-driven notion of, okay, let's find ways within which to make society holistic and humanistic. It's really very much the opposite. So this involves minority groups in society that are targeted for derogation, hate, and death. So we're looking at forms such as apartheid, Jim Crow segregation, the Trail of Tears, the Holocaust, the Armenian Holocaust, and slavery. These are the most prominent examples of this end of the range.